Hey everyone, this is Andrew J. Polk with News Radio 690 KTSM and host of Talk El Paso. We had done an extended interview with Congresswoman Veronica Escobar of El Paso about her going to vote on the HEROES Act, which has now passed the House vote and faces a very difficult time in the Republican-controlled Senate now. We weren't able to air the full thing due to time constraints, so here, presented now, is the full, complete interview with Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, again, on her way to vote on the HEROES Act. Joining me now, we have El Paso Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So we're catching up with you here right now before you go down to the House floor before voting on the 2020 HEROES Act.
Right.
So for people who may not be familiar, I feel a lot of people have heard about the CARES Act, but this, in that same vein here of coronavirus response bills, what is the HEROES Act?
So for context, Andrew, just so folks at home understand what we're voting on, many of the provisions within the HEROES Act are the same provisions that were in the CARES Act. So many of these fundamental components were embraced in a bipartisan way by members of Congress for the last few pieces of legislation. We understand the magnitude of this crisis. This is unprecedented. It's enormous. We have heard the pain and suffering that families and businesses and healthcare workers and governments are feeling in our communities, and the HEROES Act is a response to that. One of the major priorities in the HEROES Act, however, that was left out of the CARES Act, or the supplemental to the CARES Act, was more funding for local and state governments. I can tell you, as having been El Paso's county judge for 2 terms and a county commissioner for 1 term, I know the significance of local governments. And in El Paso, our local governments are heavily reliant on local property taxes and sales tax revenue. And we know that sales tax revenues have taken a huge hit. We know that local governments' revenue streams are hurting. We've seen at the city of El Paso, for example, that there have been furloughs. I lived through the collapse of the housing of the housing bubble back in 2008, and we had to implement some really serious cuts. We laid people off, we shut down programs, we furloughed employees. The provision in the HEROES Act for funding for state and local governments is something that we're doing to try to help mitigate that kind of action. I don't want to see local governments lay people off or furlough them, because, Andrew, I think almost 50% of the budget, if not more, both at the city and the county, is for our first responders, for fire, for police, the very people that we need and that we're depending on during this crisis. So $1 billion in this bill goes to El Paso's local governments. And tied to that is the flexibility that they will need in order to address their revenue shortfall. So they're going to be able to use the money in a much more flexible way than in the first round of funding. $35 billion will go directly to the state of Texas to, again, help mitigate and to prevent cuts that may come during the next legislative session. We want to make sure that we try to keep our governments whole. Additionally, many of the things that I fought for, things that I heard directly from the local community, have made it into the bill. So I heard from families that they need an additional stimulus payment. It's in there. I heard from families that simply because their kids were over 17 didn't mean they were not dependents. And so the changes to expand who qualifies for the stimulus payment within a family, that change was included. I also have seen the long lines, the food shortages, the long lines at food banks. So we've added additional funding to address rising hunger and food insecurity. We also, I don't know if you saw this, but I sent a letter to local leaders after a number of conversations with Dr. Fauci, who told me he was really concerned about vulnerable communities made up of a minority population. So Latino and African American communities where the death rates are disproportionately higher. So, for example, in the United States, Latinos make up, I think, 27% of the population, but we make up, 18% of the population, yet we make up 27% of the deaths. So he talked about the fact that we need a more robust testing and tracing strategy. I fought for that in this bill to prioritize communities like ours for that funding, and we got it. We also have seen a huge impact on mental health. We asked for more funding for that. We got it. We asked for housing support. We got it. We asked for hazard pay for essential workers. We got it. So, while the bill, there's no bill that is perfect. There's no bill that does absolutely everything you want it to. And I definitely have things that I'm going to be pushing in the next round of legislation. This bill will really be significantly helpful and supportive to our community.
If you're just joining us, my guest right now is Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. We're talking about the HEROES Act, the latest proposed round of funding and direct stimulus payments in response to the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. If people want to find out more information, do you have any particular good resources you want to point people towards? This bill is very extensive. It's 1,800 pages, and the funding is estimated to be around $3 trillion in total.
Right, and the summary is 90 pages, so it's a lot, for people. So we are going to have on our website, escobar.house.gov, we will, over the weekend and early next week, be uploading lots of information for the community. I'm going to be having a telephone town hall meeting next week so that I can lay out the broad parameters of the bill for the community. Now, obviously, we still need Senate support, and unfortunately, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who did bring the Senate back to D.C., has yet to have the Senate vote on any kind of relief package for the American people since bringing the Senate back. They've been focused only on pretty much on confirming President Trump's judges. We are pleading with him to hear the cries of the American public. We are pleading with him to take a look at the long lines at the food banks, to take a look at the numbers of Americans who are unemployed, numbers that are growing by the day. We are pleading with him to understand the depth of the need for more testing and tracing, so that we can negotiate on a bill and get money out the door as soon as possible to offer relief to a country that is deeply suffering.
Now, as you mentioned, the Senate side of things, obviously, Senate Republicans have largely seemed to have declared this bill dead on arrival to their side of Congress, and even President Trump saying that not enthusiastic about signing more stimulus spending and even possibly threatening a veto on this. So I guess, what do you feel are the chances of this actually moving forward?
I am an eternal optimist, Andrew, but I also know that things don't happen on their own. We need the American public to pressure their senators. This isn't going to happen unless the Senate understands the depth of the pain that Americans are in. And, I know that folks are tired of calling into their senators, calling into the White House, but we can't stop. We've done our job. We've provided a great vehicle for help in a time of crisis. We need the other side to act. And if they're not going to act out of a sense of duty, then we need the American public to do everything possible to push them to act.
more specifically, some of the criticisms of this bill have been that it's too broad, that would be the largest single spending bill ever passed by Congress, and that's something a bit more cut down and a bit more specific. So instead of one big omnibus bill like this, making it several or many more specific bills, one addressing spending or the stimulus payments, one addressing local governments, something along those lines. Is that on the table from your perspective?
Well, I do want to clarify, this bill is specific. That's why it's 1,800 pages. It's very prescriptive. It lays out very specifically what the money is for, where it goes, places limitations, et cetera. What some folks are saying, as you mentioned, is that they want it broken up so that people can vote against certain provisions or certain aspects of it and vote for certain aspects of it. Generally, when you create an omnibus bill, which is a bill that's made up of several different agencies, it's done so that people are not going to necessarily kill certain aspects of it that some folks may think are necessary. And so I'll give you an example. There's been criticism that we shouldn't focus on providing broadband to certain communities for the kids who have to learn at home. And, if you didn't tie that to state and local government funding, you might not get that broadband for those kids. We know in El Paso, we need that. There are kids who live in the outlying areas, even kids who live inside the city, in some of the poorest zip codes in the country that need it if they are going to keep up with their studies. But there's a lot of people who don't agree with that. So the strategy is tie something that a lot of folks would vote against to something that most people want. I mean, it's a political strategy. People can disagree with it. It's been done. It happens all the time. It is what it is.
One final question I have for you here. We talked a little bit about some of those stimulus payments, of which this bill does include. What does the bill do to address any kind of vote by mail or absentee voting?
Glad you brought it up. It's interesting. I've seen ramping up on Facebook of the effort to prevent people from having access to a ballot by mail. This actually it provides more funding for secretaries of state in each state, that funding that will go into counties like El Paso specifically for mail-in ballots, and for those counties that also want to have safe early voting. It provides for the equipment, the cleaning materials, et cetera, that they would need. I do want to talk a little bit about that, Andrew, because the conspiracy theories are, I think, really harmful and not rooted in fact. And I want to describe for the public why it's important to both preserve people's right to vote and their decision to be safe. If this pandemic, first of all, we've got a July runoff.
Right.
We don't know if the pandemic will have subsided by then. And one of the things that many of us are very concerned about, and these are legitimate concerns, many of our polling locations are shut down, like schools. When you go to schools to vote, it's under normal circumstances, but these are not normal circumstances. So there will be a very small number of places available for elections offices to use for voting. If you have not seen the photos and video of what's happened in other states that did not have mail-in ballots during the pandemic, what you don't know is then that people literally had to stand and wait for hours and hours in the rain, in the snow, the elderly, you name it. They had to wait, stand 6 feet apart. Every time somebody uses a voting machine, it's not like it is an efficient process. The elections folks then have to go in and clean everything before the next group of 3 or 4 or 5 people walk in. It is an extremely time-consuming process. There's absolutely no need to put people through that kind of unreasonable process. There's no reason for elections offices to struggle to find sites and volunteers and paid staffers to work these elections. There will be a diminished pool of people who would be willing to work during a pandemic, literally, having to be in very close proximity to people over and over again. So we've got the July runoff, we've got the November general election. There's projections by Dr. Fauci and others that we will see the pandemic come back in the fall. We have to be prepared for that. Mail-in ballots have been safely and securely used for generations, literally. When I was away at college, I sent in a mail-in ballot. Both my kids in college used mail-in ballots. My brother, who's a veteran of the Navy, a foreign service officer who lives overseas, uses a mail-in ballot. The military uses mail-in ballots. Seniors and those who are sick use mail-in ballots. This idea that what's been floating around is that Republicans can't win when there's mail-in ballots, that's false. We just saw an election in California, the election where my former colleague Katie Hill was replaced by an incoming member of Congress, Congressman-elect Garcia. He's a Republican. He won with mail-in ballots. The whole state of Washington, or maybe it's Oregon, I can't remember which, has used a mail-in ballot program for years, and it's worked and it's safe. The needless fear-mongering around mail-in ballots, it is directly linked to a tactic by some to limit people's access to the voting booth. So I believe in the opposite. I want to see increased numbers of people voting. It's an important component of our democracy. It helps determine our leadership and the direction we're going in as a country. There's no reason to limit people's access during a pandemic. We're better than that. So I'm very proud of that component in this bill.
And doing a quick check here, it is Oregon that has done the pretty widespread vote by mail here for a while. So, All right, well, Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. Again, ahead of you, headed to the House floor to vote on the HEROES Act. And again, if people want to find out more information about what is going to be in there, the provisions of it, they can visit your congressional website, escobar.house.gov, which we'll also have posted on our Facebook page in the live stream there. Thank you very much for talking with us today, Congresswoman
Thank you
Escobar.
so much, Andrew. Take care.
And again, that was Congresswoman Veronica Escobar speaking with us ahead of the House vote. As it stands at this point, it has now passed the House, that HEROES Act, the latest round of coronavirus stimulus funding, among other things. Still, it faces a very difficult challenge in the Senate, if it could even be called a challenge, because it has been largely declared dead on arrival, as we discussed. But there's the full interview, so thank you for tuning in for that. We'll also be posting the shortened version with just the part that did not make air. So thank you for tuning in. Remember, Talk El Paso airs every Saturday morning from 9 to 10 a.m. on News Radio 690 KTSM. Have a great day.